The bell rang at 8:02 and 32 children lifted their heads, pencils ready, eyes bright. By dusk, the desks were still warm, the air still smelled like crayons and rain, and every name hung in the room like a question no one could answer. The town was one of those places the highway barely noticed. Two diners, one feed store, a water tower with the mascot hand-painted on the side. That morning, a thin drizzle settled over the prairie like a veil. The yellow school bus sighed at the curb, its wipers dragging a slow beat across the glass. The driver, a quiet man named Ray with a navy cap and a thermos dented along the bottom, tapped the wheel while he watched the kids step down, collars up, heads bowed against the cold. In the long brick school, the fluorescent lights hummed a tired song. Somewhere a locker door slammed, metal on metal, then echoes faded into the kind of stillness you only hear on school mornings, busy but somehow tender. In room 6, Miss Albright smoothed the edges of a stack of permission slips until they were square, then pressed the heel of her hand to the chalkboard to erase yesterday's words. She paused when she saw what she had written and forgot to clean. Lantern, orchard, vanish. Each word held a small drift of dust at its base, a soft snowfall of chalk. Miss Albright was 26 and still wore the same cardigan because it made her feel steady, though one elbow had thinned to a shine. She kept a jar of peppermints on her desk for difficult days. She kept a list of who had lost a tooth, who had a new puppy, who needed the front row so they could see. She believed in straight lines and soft voices, and she believed that every child wanted to be good if someone was patient enough to show them how. When the bell finished ringing, she stood by the door with her attendance sheet and watched 32 children cross the threshold, each one giving her a little nod the way you do when the person at the door is your safe place. "Good morning," she said, and they said it back in a chorus that warmed the room. At the sheriff's office across from the grain elevator, Mee Carver lifted the receiver of a beige phone and tucked it between shoulder and ear while her other hand poured coffee. The deputy on the other end was talking about calves loose on County D, but Mee was only half listening. She could see the bus through the fogged window, can see kids spilling in a bright line along the sidewalk like marbles poured from a jar. She was 43, with a son stationed overseas and a dog that slept under her desk and a way of speaking that made people straighten without knowing why. Mee knew this town down to the sound the church bell made when it was cold, down to which porch boards would creak in the early hours. Some mornings she wished for a crime worth all the training and the years and the badge. Most mornings she was grateful for quiet. The janitor, Hector Ruiz, unlocked the mop closet at the end of the East Hall and took in the smell that lived there, bleach and old wood and damp rags. He was 60 and had a way with broken things. He kept a shoebox in the bottom of his locker filled with spare screws and bent nails he might someday straighten. He liked the school best in the hour before the kids came, when the halls were his alone and the floors shone and the ceilings buzzed, and every closed door held a promise that the day ahead could go right. As the children brushed past him, he tipped his cap. The little ones called him Mr. Hector with a gentle stumble on the second syllable. He liked that too. By 9, the rain had given way to a sky the color of a bruise, flat and wide over the fields. Miss Albright paced between rows, her heels soft on the linoleum, and pointed to the spelling list on the board. She had written them out in her neat hand and underlined each one twice. Lantern, orchard, vanish. "Tell me what a lantern does," she said, and 32 voices rose in small bursts. "It lights the dark. You take it camping. Mine got hot and my dad told me don't touch. We keep one in the hallway because the storm last winter knocked out the lights for 3 days." "Good," she said, and it felt for a little while like the world might always be about lamps you can carry in your hand and baskets of fruit and the word that means to disappear and how it sits heavy in your mouth, like it doesn't want to leave your tongue. At 10:15, the office called to say the copier was finally back to life. Miss Albright set the permission slips aside, placed the worksheets for the history lesson on top, and told the class to take out their journals. "Write for 10 minutes, she said. "Anything, how you feel about the rain, a dream you had, 3 wishes, I'll be back before the 3rd wish." She smiled as she said it because she liked to keep promises. As she stepped into the corridor, the smell of chalk and damp wool thinned behind her. She looked down the hall and saw Hector kneeling by a loose tile. He lifted his head and gave her a small wave. The fluorescent lights flickered, then held steady. The corridor clock read 10:16. It took less than a minute to reach the copier room. She fed the first page through, listened for the warm rush of paper, and thought about lanterns and orchards and how vanish might be too hard a word for a Friday. She checked her watch while the machine stuttered. 10:18. When she came back, the room felt oddly large. The journals were open to blank pages. Pencils lay as if dropped mid-thought. The jar of peppermints glimmered in the flat light. 32 chairs sat obediently in rows. A sweater hung from the back of a seat, like someone would be right back. She stood with one hand on the door and waited for the sound of children that should have rushed to greet her, whispers, the scrape of a chair leg, a cough. She took one step into the room and then another. "All right," she said, her voice trying to be light. "If this is a trick, it's a good one. You've got your teacher." The silence that answered her was the kind that makes your ears ring. She turned to the coat hooks, slickers hung in happy colors, a trail of wet footprints drying on the floor. She crossed to the window and pressed her palm to the glass. Outside, the drizzle had eased and the playground sat empty, swings at rest, a tetherball rope wound tight by the wind. She checked the bathrooms, the little side closet where she kept the science kits, the reading nook behind the bookcase. The room was the same in all directions, but the center was gone. In the front office, the secretary held the phone and frowned at the line of numbers on a pad. She blinked when Miss Albright stepped through the door empty-handed, without the paper smile she wore for small emergencies. "I can't find them," Miss Albright said. "I left them 5 minutes. I can't find them." The secretary tried to laugh, then saw the white around the teacher's mouth and didn't. She called Ray, the bus driver. "No, he dropped them off this morning at 7:51, same as always." She called the lunch staff. No, they hadn't come early or late. She called the principal, who came at a hurried walk, tie loose, glasses already in his hand as if he'd been expecting to need them. "We must have a sub-assembly no one told us about," he said. Then he looked at Miss Albright and stopped himself. He sent 2 aides down the hall at a run. At the sheriff's office, the radio crackled with a code Me knew meant possible missing. The tone in the dispatcher's voice carried an edge she could feel in her chest. Me put down her coffee. "I'm heading over," she said, and the dog lifted its head and thumped its tail, then settled again because this wasn't his job. The school sat 3 minutes away. She ran a stop sign and didn't bother to check her speed. Hector had just made the last pass with his mop near the gym when he felt it. The air changed. The fluorescent hum rose a note like a bottle blown across the mouth by a careless breath. He stood still and listened. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was the absence of one. On school days, the building has a pulse, quiet but steady, the beat of kids moving, teachers talking, doors closing, someone sneezing, a pencil tapping a desk. For a second, that pulse went flat. Hector stared at the hallway clock. The second hand ticked forward, then hesitated, then slid backward the space of a breath. He rubbed his eyes and laughed at himself. When he looked again, the hand was right where it should be. He kept the story of that hiccup to himself for hours, then days. Years later, he could still see it, the way the little red hand pressed its nose up against time and decided it couldn't go on the way it had been. Me arrived to find the front office squeezed by fear, the way a room gets smaller when everyone tries to think in it. She took in the posture of the adults, the way the secretary held her pen like a tightrope, how the principal's tie had been retied wrong. She stepped into room 6 and looked at the scene the way she'd been taught to look, edges, surfaces, center. The windows were locked from the inside. The clock above the door read 10:23. "What time is that?" she asked without looking up. "It's right," the principal said. "We checked with the office." Me's eyes went to the chalkboard and the words left there like a dare. Lantern, orchard, vanish. She made a note without thinking. She made another note, 32 desks, 32 chairs, 32 names. She didn't write them now, she would soon. By noon, word had hopped from mouth to mouth and kitchen to kitchen and lunch pail to lunch pail. The school tightened its doors. A deputy led a pair of dogs down the hallway, their nails ticking rapid little messages across the floor. Me found Ray in the bus yard with his hand flat on the hood of his bus like it was a living thing trying to calm itself. "You saw them?" she asked. "I always see them," he said. "They lined up like always. Danny Prout tried to bring a frog and I told him no." He laughed. "He said it was a grasshopper, not a frog. I told him no anyway." He looked at his shoes. His coat was red with the elbow patched in black. "He showed me the patch last week. He was proud of how his mother had sewn it. You don't forget things like that." "You remember the time?" Me asked. 7:51, it's always 7:51. She wrote that too, routines mattered. Routines were breadcrumbs when people went missing, marking the way through a dark wood. At 3, parents filled the front steps, faces wet not from rain anymore but from fear. They stood shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same thin air, names becoming prayers. Have you seen, do you know, my boy was wearing, the principal tried to be big enough to answer all of them at once. The secretary closed and opened drawers because it was a motion that felt like work. Me stepped onto a chair so she could be seen. She lifted her palms, the universal sign that says listen. "We are looking," she said, voice low and clear. "We will keep looking." She did not say everything would be fine. She did not lie. That small choice became a kind of promise, too. Nora Bell stood on the edge of the crowd with her coat half closed because she hadn't remembered the buttons when the call came. She was 37 and worked mornings at the bakery, icing pastries until the kitchen was sugared white. Her daughter Ruth wore her hair in 2 braids so tight they left dents when she took them out at night, and she liked to leave notes for her mother where Nora would find them on the bread box in the pocket of her coat. Little drawings of cats in hats and stick figures holding balloons. Nora pressed her fingers to the thin gold chain at her collarbone because that was where she had learned to keep her grief in other years. As the crowd shifted, she took small steps forward until she could see Me's eyes. She wanted to ask questions that would show the truth she feared already. Instead, she asked, "Can I help?" Me nodded because there would be a time very soon when she would need mothers who were good at finding small things. Because small things sometimes led you the only way left to go. By dusk, the town had become one body walking in every direction. Deputies swept the back roads, tires making muddy scars down the edges where the grass had held for 40 years. Volunteers lined the dry creek beds with lanterns that threw weak saucers of light across the stones. They climbed fences and ducked under barbed wire, careful of the burrs that hooked into denim and refused to let go. A helicopter thumped the night with its blades, and a searchlight combed a field where scarecrows leaned with their arms out like watchers too tired to lift their hands a fraction higher. Somebody turned on a generator behind the school to run floodlights across the playground, and their hum was only slightly higher than that of the fluorescent lights inside room 6, still burning, still dumb. Inside the classroom, Me opened the attendance book and found the names. She read them out loud once for herself, quietly, like saying them could conjure each child from wherever 32 hearts had gone. Alma Dorsey, Benjamin Hayes, Carly Quinn, Danny Prout, even the names she didn't know yet felt like people she had failed. She held her finger to each one as she spoke, a steady little march along the blue lines. When she finished, she said them again for the microphone the deputy held near her mouth, so the tape would keep them even if no one else did. In years to come, when the tape was played, you could hear her breath steady once halfway through, the moment she realized that saying them wouldn't bring them back, but it was still the only thing that felt right. Miss Albright sat on the edge of her desk chair with her hands around the jar of peppermints, because holding something simple made the world feel less likely to tip. A young deputy asked her for the 10th time to tell him exactly what happened. From the moment the bell rang to the moment she walked back into the classroom and felt the shape of the empty space. The story didn't change because there was no room inside it for change. She said the clock times, the sound of the copier, the way she had left a pencil that rolled toward the aisle and stopped there, pointed at nothing. She said the word vanish and then hated that she had said it because it tasted like the chalk on the board, and it felt like she had put the word into their path without meaning to. Hector watched the night fill the windows and thought about the hiccup in the clock. He caught me in the hall and lifted a shoulder before he spoke, apologizing with his body for words that would sound foolish. "It was probably nothing," he said. "Tell me anyway," she answered, so he did. He told her about the second hand that pressed forward and slid back. He told her about how the hum had changed for a second, a hair higher, like a string pulled too tight. He told her he had seen a lot of old buildings do a lot of odd things, but he had never felt a silence like the one he felt at 10, 18, and some seconds. Me made a note. Later, she would wonder if making the note had been an act of faith that the small things might someday matter. By 10 that night, the school principal had grown small in his suit, as if the fabric had eaten some of him. He began to notice details that hadn't pierced his gaze earlier. The way one of the desk legs wobbled, the gum pressed under the seat of chair 12. The smear of yellow paint on the cuff of his pants where he had brushed the playground railings that morning when he walked the perimeter without a good reason to do so beyond habit. He stood in the doorway and felt the room holding that last hour, the one where for a few breaths everything had still been normal. He could smell pencil shavings, lemon cleaner, damp wool, and the sweat that a room of children leaves behind like a cloud. He rubbed his fingers together and they came away white with chalk. Nora went home for a sweater and came back with a thermos of coffee and a handful of notes written by other mothers who had tried to sleep and failed. She tucked the notes into Me's hand. I have soup on if anyone needs it. I can watch smaller kids so the older ones can search. I'm at the old school gym and I have blankets. It was what towns did when things went wrong. They built a net out of small kindnesses and hoped the fall would be less. Nora walked to the edge of the field where the searchlight traced slow sweeps and listened to the crickets. They sounded normal, which felt like betrayal. Around midnight, the helicopter landed to refuel, and for a minute the night was quiet enough that the sound of the generator seemed loud enough to push back the dark. Me called in from the field to report a shoe found by the north fence, size small, scuffed, the lace knotted with care. By the time Nora reached the fence line, the shoe had been bagged and carried away. Me stood with her, hands in her pockets, hat tipped back a little. We brought the dogs across that ditch 3 times, she said. If there were tracks, they're gone now under the wet. If there was a car, the mud, too churned to tell whose. Whose shoe? Nora asked. Me shook her head. We'll know when we cross-check tomorrow. She didn't add, if the shoe belonged to one of the 32, it meant they had been here. If it didn't, it meant nothing, and nothing was worse than something right now. In the early hours, someone brought a box of candles to the school steps, and mothers and fathers lit them automatically, like they had trained for this without knowing. The flames leaned the same direction in the wind, little bending bodies trying to brace. Miss Albright stood a few feet back, not wanting to be seen in case her face made it worse for someone else. She felt the chalk dust still on her fingers and rubbed it away on the hem of her skirt, then wished she hadn't. She looked at the board one last time before she would make herself go home and sit in a chair and wait for daylight to make everything look different enough to begin again. Lantern, orchard, vanish. She picked up the eraser, she set it down. She couldn't make herself wipe the words away. It felt like erasing tracks. When dawn edged the horizon with a thin strip of pewter, the searchers came back with edges of themselves rubbed raw. Nora's thermos was empty. Hector's hands stung with tiny cuts from brush he had pushed through, and a burr had attached itself to the cuff of his work pants and would not let go no matter how he picked at it. Me sat on the step with her back against the brick and thought about what she would say at the morning briefing that would not feel like asking people to climb the same hill without telling them why. She opened the attendance book again and traced the names with her eyes the way she had before. There is a way grief narrows a life to a single question, and though the question rarely changes, the words you use to ask it do. Where did they go? Who took them? How did no one see? How long until we find them? She did not write those. She held them in her mouth like a prayer and said them to the sky. Behind her, room 6 waited in morning light. It was the kind of light that made the chalk lines on the board glow, that turned the dust into soft weather. The journals lay open to their first pages. If you bent close, you could see where a pencil tip had pressed a dot, then lifted, as if a thought had just begun. On the teacher's desk, the jar of peppermints caught the light and threw it in little red and white diamonds across the wood. In the coat row, a small yellow slicker hung by itself, a hood with a little point at the top pulled up as if ready for a head. By the end of that first day, the town had a shared dream it could not wake from. It was the kind of dream where you walk room to room calling a name and your voice is swallowed by walls that do not care. Sheriff Me Carver would turn the day over in her mind until it had no edges left. Mother Nora Bell would fold and unfold the sweater Ruth had left on her chair and breathe into it as if she could warm the sleeves from the inside out. Janitor Hector Ruiz would sweep the East Hall until the floor shone like a pond at dusk, and then look up at the clock to watch the second hand behave itself like a good child. Miss Albright would sit at her kitchen table with the attendance book and a pen and write every name again on a clean sheet of paper, because writing them was the only way she knew to keep them. She wrote in the same order as roll call, saying each one under her breath as the pen made the curves and lines, her mouth shaping them like this might be her work now forever. When she reached the last name, she waited, as if another might come to mind, as if one had been hiding at the end all along. The silence that answered her was deep and plain, but it was not empty. It held 32 chairs, a blackboard thick with chalk dust, a bus idling in the rain, a driver tapping a wheel, a janitor listening to a clock, a sheriff steadying her voice, a mother pressing her hand to a necklace because she didn't know where else to put it, and a teacher staring at 3 words she would never again be able to say without feeling the floor tilt. When the candle wicks burned down to soft black commas, and the crickets sang like they had every night long before any of this, the town closed its eyes not to forget, but to remember better, and somewhere far past the edge of the fields, the light of a single lantern trembled in the dark, as if searching too. By the time the blade struck glass, the town had learned to speak in a voice no louder than breath. The jar rose from the earth slick with mud and dust, and with it came a cold that did not belong to summer. 25 years is a long time to hold your tongue. The school, a low brick line on the prairie, learned to sit with its eyes down. Its windows reflected more rumor than sky. At first the talk was sharp and quick like rain on a tin roof, a wrong turn at mile 19, a turnout no one knew about beyond the cottonwoods, an unmarked quarry that ate machines and men. Then the talk turned inward and soft. A cult in the grain silos, they said, and when they said cult they made the word small, as if making it small could make it less real. There were nights when the whole town felt like it was leaning to listen. You could hear it at the diner when forks paused on plates. You could feel it on the church steps where hands found hands without looking. The school put on a brave face. The lawn got mown. The flags went up on the right days. But grief warped the routines that tell a place who it is. Christmas pageants were canceled for a long time, and when the first one returned years later, the shepherds stood stiff and wide-eyed as if they feared the light. Lockers along the East Hall were padlocked and then left alone, their doors turned into shrines with taped photos and fatting ribbon. It became a habit to lower your voice near them, even if you were alone. Miss Albright never erased the chalkboard in room 6 on the first of the month, not all the way. A faint powder of old words always lingered in the corners, like the breath of someone still thinking. Sheriff Me Carver kept her badge in a drawer after she retired, wrapped in a handkerchief that had been her mother's. She swore she didn't keep the drawer locked, but her hand always paused a fraction before she opened it, as if there were a weight inside. She walked her dog on the gravel road past the school at sunrise and hated herself for counting the minutes between her steps. The dog that used to sleep under her desk had long since gone where old dogs go, and sometimes she thought she could still hear his claws on the linoleum of memory. She knew who parked where, which porch light burned late, who checked their mail twice in case a letter had come, and who could no longer bear to look in the box. She knew the wind by the way it rattled the flag rope against the pole near the office door. She knew when the wind meant rain and when it meant nothing. Nora Bell learned the shape of seasons by what did not happen. There was no December night of paper halos and cheap glitter. There were no class photos taped to the fridge with crooked magnets shaped like fruit. There were no new shoe sizes written in pencil inside a closet door. She still found notes sometimes in odd places, one deep in her winter coat pocket years after the world had changed, a little drawing of a cat with a hat and a heart on its chest. She kept that note in a book she knew she would reach for when she felt her hands begin to shake, a book with a blue cover and pages that smelled faintly of glue and dust. She worked at the bakery until the new owner took over and changed the recipes, and then she worked at the library, where the quiet felt clean and kind. She stopped fixing her hair the way Ruth had liked because looking like herself in the mirror was too sharp. Hector Ruiz mopped the East Hall until it was a kind of prayer. He could make floors shine like water. He went slower now and talked to the building under his breath, as if it were a living thing that needed to be told what day it was. He kept the shoebox of screws and bent nails the way he always had, and added to it a few coins found under lockers, a ribbon, a glass marble the color of a sky after storm. He learned to listen for any change in the hum of the lights. He learned to tell one silence from another. The school's silence was different from the silence of a winter field, and he knew it, and he was one of the few who could say it without his voice breaking. There were years when nothing new broke the surface, and the town settled into the hard kind of waiting that blunts the edges of grief. People married and moved, and those who stayed learned the look of visitors who came only to stand in front of the building and say, "This is where it happened." Reporters would come on certain anniversaries, notebooks open, eyes too bright. The principal closed the blinds and set a note on the office door that said, "We are still a school. Please be kind." The note didn't help much. It was a drought year that made the ground crack wide enough to show what it had been hiding. The spring came late and thin. The summer came early and mean. The corn whispered in the fields but made tight, sorrowful ears, and the pasture grass crisped at the edges first, then browned at the middle like paper touched by match. Wells sank. Windmills creaked and slowed. By August, the air held a fine dust you could not see until you wiped your hand across a dark table and left a clean line that looked like you had taken something that belonged to the room. On a Sunday morning, a farmer named Walt Garner took his old tractor out past the far fence line where he hadn't plowed in years. The drought made him braver than was smart. He told himself fresh ground might give him one more decent cut of feed. The sun was still low and the light lay flat across the ground and made the cracks look like maps to places he did not want to go. He lowered his disc and felt it bite. The field gave that small first resistance, then yielded. He found a rhythm. The engine's thrum steadied him. He was thinking about nothing at all, which is when most things happen. The blade struck something with a sound so clean it made his teeth ache. Glass, not rock. The tractor stuttered, choked, and died. Dust settled back to earth in a soft sigh. Walt climbed down slow, held one hand out to tell the world to wait a second. He scraped with his boot at the broken clods. Mud fell away in sheets. What he saw there was a jar, a thick old-weight glass jar the color of a winter pond. It had no label, no shine. It had a lid sealed with wax gone brown and hard, wax that had run in a neat ring and cooled into that ring as if a careful hand had helped it along. He squatted on his heels and reached for it. The glass was warm with sun on top and cold as a basement below. It stuck a little when he pulled. He set it on the cracked earth and wiped his hands on his jeans because he felt caught between the urge to run and the need to be gentle. The jar was no bigger than his palm around, but heavy, as if the inside weighed more than it should. Inside was an old photograph folded once, and even through the glass it looked like a sleeping thing. Walt set the jar on his truck seat like it might roll away and called the sheriff with fingers that did not feel like his own. The new sheriff was a man named Pike, chewed pencils, wore press shirts, and had not yet learned when to say less. He said he'd be right out. Walt hung up, stared at the thin horizon, and did not turn the key. Word makes its own wind. Me heard before her second cup of coffee. She stood in her kitchen with the scarred countertop and looked at the drawer that held her badge. She did not open it. She folded a clean handkerchief in her pocket anyway and drove out toward Walt's far field at a careful speed, as if not shaking the air would make whatever had been found more likely to stay. Sheriff Pike's truck sat crooked on the edge of the field, dust still rising from the wheels. He'd gotten out too fast. Walt stood with his hands on his hips and looked like a man who had accidentally unearthed an old bone and wondered what kind of animal it came from. Me nodded at both men and then let her eyes go to the jar on the seat. It looked ordinary and wrong all at once. Pike had a pair of latex gloves out and was trying to get one on without snapping it. He was young enough to care about not snapping. "Don't open it here," Me said quietly. Pike looked at her like he wanted to say, "I'm the sheriff." He closed his mouth without saying it, which was good. "Air does things," she added. "We're not ready for what air might do." Pike nodded, and the nod meant, "I will take your advice even when you are not in charge of me." Walt tipped his cap, which meant thank you for coming even though I did not want anyone to come. They took the jar to the little room at the back of the station that had once been for cleaning guns and was now for cleaning grief. Me stood to the side and watched the gloved hands. Pike loosened the wax with the edge of a knife like a man cutting free a child whose shoelace has gotten caught in an escalator. The lid turned with a sigh, a tiny breath, as if the jar itself had decided to speak. The smell that came up was the smell of old paper and faint vinegar and something else, metal left in rain and brought into a warm room. Pike set the lid aside, and the three of them leaned in like people at a magic show who know they will be disappointed and still hope. Pike used tweezers to lift the folded photo and lay it on a clean cloth. The picture had the soft gloss of drugstore prints from back when every town had a counter where you dropped off a roll in a small envelope and came back 3 days later to open the clean white glue of paper and slide the pictures out with a thrill that there might be something there. Pike unfolded the photo with care. He stopped moving. His mouth opened. He said nothing. The class stood shoulder to shoulder in the low light of a field that could have been anywhere near here. 32 faces unchanged by years. The girl with the tight braids had tight braids. The boy with the patched elbow had the same patch on his red sweater, now more real than anything else in the room. Their hair looked damp, the way hair looks when the fog has been walking across a field and decided to rest in it. The flash had carved white ovals from their eyes, that old white that makes people on the page look like they saw something a fraction too bright at the last second. No one had made a hand sign. No one had held a peace sign or stuck out a tongue. They stood like children told to behave for a stranger with a camera. Behind them, a crooked windmill leaned a little as if tired, and the faint curve of a distant silo cut into the edge of the sky. It was night, or almost. The grass at their ankles was dark. The breath at their mouths might have been visible if the flash had not flattened it. Me felt the floor tilt the way it had the morning the names were spoken into a tape recorder. Pike finally remembered to breathe. Walt took off his cap and held it against his chest like he was in church. "This is a joke," Pike said, but his voice did not carry faith. "A trick, someone planted this." Me did not answer. She took the photo by its corner and turned it over. On the back, in pencil, in a firm square hand, were 2 words, "Everyone present." There are phrases that crack open a body like a bell. That was one of them. It was what teachers sometimes said after roll call, a small set of words meant to settle the room. It was also now a sentence that scraped bone. Miss Albright came to the station without being asked. She didn't know why she had gotten in the car, only that her hands had found the keys and her mouth had said, "Shoes," without thinking, and her feet had listened. She walked into the back room and stopped at the door. She knew the shape of the children like she knew the color of her own kitchen walls in the dark. She put her palm to her mouth and tasted salt. She looked at the pencil on the back and closed her eyes. When she opened them, she said, "It looks like my writing." The room breathed out. Then she said, "But it's not." She pointed to the E. "I make my E's with a loop at the end that rises like a hook. This one ends flat. The R is mine, but the way the N ends, it's not mine." She turned away and leaned her forehead against the cool cinderblock wall and thought about the chalk words she had left on the board the day life split and how she had never forgiven her hand for that. The fault lines were not new. The jar only made them glow. People pulled out their old maps of blame and drew new lines on top. Science was called in shirts and careful voices, carrying small cases with latches that named their contents without words. Folklore pulled up a chair and crossed its legs, comfortable, unashamed. Memory pointed at the photo and whispered, "I know that sweater." Evidence held up a hand and said, "We will speak, but not fast." The lab took the photograph and cut small slivers from its edges the way a doctor might cut a thread from a wound. They spoke of paper stock and emulsions and the way silver behaves when it has been kept from air. They put it under lights and saw what lights would give. A woman with hair pulled tight explained how old drugstore prints sometimes had a date stamped in small purple letters near the border. This one did not. But its border was a type most common at the very end of the 70s and the start of the 80s. The ink on the back, she said, looked right. Graphite ages in a way that leaves a certain shine. The wax seal was hand-done, not factory. The glass was old canning glass, not new mason, and it had the faint softness of a thing used and washed and used again. Could someone have made this last week with old things saved for a bad joke? Maybe. Could someone have made this the night the children went away? Maybe. Science's name was maybe more than most people wanted. Folklore's name was yes and no, both at once. The old men at the diner leaned back and said they'd heard about lights along the old section road near mile 19, how a fog stood there like a wall in some seasons, how if you walked into it you could hear a little singing the way wires sing in wind. The waitress said her grandmother had told her to avoid the unmarked quarry after dark because the land remembered those who had fallen and tried to bring company. A boy whose aunt cleaned the towers at the grain silos said he had seen symbols scratched in the dust there, circles and lines, the kind of thing that made him want to wash his hands. No one could say when they had seen these things. Everyone had heard of them. The photograph moved the way things move now, from hand to phone to screen to other towns and back again. People came again to stand in front of the school, and this time most of them did not look away when the windows gave back only their own faces. Nora sat in her car across the street, photo in her lap, a copy, not the original, printed too bright at the drugstore. She ran her thumb over the face she knew. The tight braids left dents in the little girl's hair, two neat lines. Nora had made those braids 1,000 times. She would make them again in her mind until she died. She stared at the white ovals of the eyes and tried to see past the glare to the look she knew, impulse to laugh, a little impatience, that tilt of the head that said, "Faster, Mom, do it faster." The back of the photo in her hands was blank. She did not need the words to hear them. Everyone present, her throat closed. She wanted to believe that someone with a kind heart had made the picture to give the town a breath of something other than dust. She also wanted someone to blame. She wanted to march into the station and say, "Who wrote this, and why would they do it unless they had seen them?" She did neither. She looked up at the school's windows and saw herself looking back, and for a second believed she was the ghost. Hector did not own a computer. He saw the picture in a small envelope that Me brought to the school after the lab had taken what it needed. He took it to the janitor's closet because the smell there made him steady. He sat on an upturned bucket and held the picture until his fingers warmed the paper. He did not look at the children first. He looked at the windmill. He knew windmills the way other men know birds. He knew the line of them, the tilt that meant a certain kind of wind had worried at a certain bolt. He knew there had been a crooked one out toward mile 19, near where the turnoff ran along the dry creek bed. He had mended a fence there once when he was younger and strong. Beyond it, if you walked north by the smell of sage, you got to a fence line that hid an old silo no one used anymore, tucked back where the land made a shallow bowl. He traced that faint curve in the background with a nail-bitten finger. He remembered the burrs that caught his socks and the way the grass whispered like someone's skirt. He brought the picture to me and put his finger on the edge of the world in it and said, "I know this lean. I think I do." Me spread a county map over the cafeteria table like a quilt. The map had been folded and refolded until the creases had their own memory. Mile 19 was a place on the map and a place in the mind. On paper, it was where County D met the section road and the numbers tallied right. In Pitcher's stories, mile 19 was where things slipped. She walked Hector's remembered path with her finger. "Here?" she asked. "Or here?" He squinted. "Here," he said, tapping once, sure for the first time in days. She wrote it down and did not say the part of her that felt like writing had created the line itself. The field where the jar had been found had no crooked windmill, but fields move in time. Windmills break and go, sheds lean and are taken down. A silo can be a curve in a horizon long after it feeds nothing. The search parties went out in heat that made men testy and women short with kindness. They wore hats and carried water and moved slow. You do not rush a drought, you watch your breath and you save your steps for when they matter. The dogs panted and licked dry air. Men who had sworn never to look again bent to study fence wire as if it had advice to give. They found nothing but old bones of deer and rabbit and an old glass insulator with a shine that pleased the palm for a second, and then was set aside because the hand wanted only one shape now. A meeting was called in the school gym because of course it was. The same hoops hung there. The floor still smelled like varnish and old sweat. Chairs scraped over the lines that told you where to stand. Sheriff Pike stood at the front and tried to be big. Me stood off to his right and tried to be steady. A woman from the lab came and talked about emulsions and weatherproof jars. She used words people did not want in their mouths like outgassing and delamination. She said the jar could have preserved the photo for years. She said it could have been placed long after the night everyone remembered. She did not say what everyone asked with their eyes. Folklore spoke next without a microphone. An old man with a voice like creek stones cleared his throat and said his grandfather had told him about a place where the ground had thin spots, where a person could step wrong and be a breath behind the rest of the world for a while. He said sometimes those spots spit things back. He said drought loosens more than soil. The room breathed as one creature and then broke into smaller animals. The ones who nodded because they needed that story, the ones who shook their heads because needing a story is not the same as having a fact. The ones who looked at Miss Albright with something like blame and something like mercy. The ones who looked at Nora the way you look at someone about to be hit by a wave again. Mercy and suspicion sat side by side because they always do. Some people brought casseroles and left them on porches with no note. Others brought questions folded into kindness like a blade in a clean cloth. Why that field? Why that windmill? Why no dates? Why that hand? Miss Albright found herself at the center of circles of people asking if she had written those words on the back 25 years ago and set the jar in the ground for the future like a woman sending a prayer forward. She wanted to laugh and she wanted to scream. She did neither. She said, I didn't. And when the question came again in different words, she said, I didn't. And when it came again with a different face, she said, I didn't, until the syllables felt like stones in her mouth. Later, she sat at her kitchen table and pulled boxes from the hall closet and spread old lesson plans and notes across the wood. Her own hands stared back at her from the past. The R were her R's. The looped E's were her E's. The N's were not. She held the jar copy up to the light and tried to make it into someone else. It was, and it was, like so much now. Ray, the bus driver, came out of the one house he had kept because he couldn't bear to leave the driveway that led to the route he'd driven. He had done 10,000 laps around that block in his mind. He had parked in that curb space in every season of the mind and changed nothing. People had whispered his name in the first year and then mostly stopped. The jar made his phone ring again. He opened his door to Sheriff Pike, who stood on the step like a man with a question he did not want to ask. Why your field? Pike said to Walt the farmer. Why not mine? Walt answered, and there the two men stood, each holding one end of a rope called answer and getting rope burn. Me walked to the old windmill site with Hector when the sun had stooped low enough to make the shadows long and a little kind. The ground out there felt different, as if someone had stretched a sheet too tight across a bed and the corners were about to let go. The windmill was gone, like they knew it would be, but 3 bolts stuck up at ankle height in a pattern that matched the memory of the line. The curve of the old silo shadowed the edge of the horizon like a bruise you don't see until you turn your head. Me stood where the camera would have stood if this were the place and closed one eye. Here, Hector said, pointing to a patch of grass that wasn't grass anymore, just the idea of it. They stood with their hands not quite touching like people in church who do not want to force anything. The breeze came in a single soft rope and pulled at their sleeves. It's a place, Hector said. Yes, Me said. They did not say more. That night, kids who had not been born when the bell rang in 1980 climbed out bedroom windows and drove out to the roads their parents had told them to avoid. They brought flashlights and told each other jokes to keep from feeling the way the hair rises on your arms when a field is too quiet. One boy saw his own light reflected in a bottle and said he had seen an eye. One girl took a picture of her friends in their straight line and then looked at it in the car and laughed and cried when the flash made their eyes white. Just white, as if all the years in between were a trick. Nora slept and woke and did not know which she was. She dreamed of a hand writing on the back of a photograph and the pencil breaking and the hand going on anyway, making marks without a lead. She woke with the taste of wood shavings in her mouth. She went to the library because the library is where you go when you need a book, and also when you need to be near people who can be quiet in the same room without causing harm. She filed returns with a motion that had saved her more than once. A girl came to the desk to ask about a book on the history of the county. Nora handed it to her and the girl said, "My mom won't let me go near the silos." Nora said, "Your mother loves you," and then had to step into the back and stand with her hand against the cool metal of a shelving cart until the wave passed. Hector brought his copy of the photo to the school at night and set it on the desk in room 6. He turned off the lights and stood at the door and let the moon lay a bit of silver on the edges of the paper. He listened to the building breathe. He waited for the clock to hiccup and it did not. He put his hand on the door frame where 1,000 hands had left skin and oil and he closed his eyes and he said their names in a voice only the door could hear. He did not get to the end. He did not need to. Who was he keeping track for now? He stayed there a long time, and when he left he took the photo with him because leaving it on the desk felt like forgetting it there, and there was enough forgetting already. The lab gave Sheriff Pike a report full of numbers and words that were trying to be gentle. The paper said the photo was likely from the right era, that the chemicals behaved as they would if sealed for years, that the jar did what jars do when a careful hand fills them and a careful hand closes them. The paper did not say who took the picture. It did not say when. It did not say these kids were here on this ground on that night. It did not say someone had them long enough to line them up and count their faces. Mercy read the paper and saw hope that someone had cared enough to send a message. Suspicion read the paper and saw a taunt. At the next meeting, Me stood and made her voice as steady as she could. "There will be no shouting," she said. "If you want to accuse, do it at a table with paper. We write things down here, we do not yell them." People nodded because they had learned to nod when she spoke. Sheriff Pike said they would expand the search to the corners of the map it would be wise to do. The woman from the lab said they would test the wax, which made people murmur, as if the wax could stand up and tell its own story. Miss Albright asked if she could see the jar again and hold the weight of the glass in her hand, just for a second. Pike looked to me and Me nodded, and when Miss Albright felt the glass, she closed her eyes again the way a person does when touching the headstone of someone loved. "Who wrote on the back?" someone asked from the fourth row. "Who wrote everyone present?" The room held its breath. "I don't know," Miss Albright said. She could have said, "Not me," but the room already had too many knots. She put the jar down and stepped back, and the space where it had sat felt cold. It was a small thing that shifted the room that night. A woman stood, thin shoulders, hair pulled back without care, someone who had moved here after the year of the bell. "Maybe," she said, "the point isn't to fight about which story we like. Maybe the point is to look at what our hands can touch. There is a windmill somewhere that leans like that. There is a silo that makes that curve. There is fog that makes hair damp. There is someone who had the steadiness to say, everyone present, with their hand on that paper, find that person, find that place." It was a simple thing to say. It was the kind of thing that can save a room for one more night. People let their shoulders drop a little. Mercy and suspicion put their hands down. For a few minutes, science and folklore agreed that the map mattered. When most had gone, Me sat alone in the gym, the smell of varnish strong under the softer smell of dust. She traced a fingertip along the line where a free throw arc met the key and felt the place where a floorboard lifted a hair at the seam. She had walked this floor 1,000 times in the first months, counting her steps, telling herself she could make a net from numbers. Now she let herself sit still and listen to her breath rub against time. She thought of the words on the back of the photograph. Everyone present. It was a promise and a dare. It was a comfort and a cut. It was the thing she had not been able to say for a quarter of a century. Outside, the night sat down on the fields, and the drought air carried sound farther than it should. You could hear a windmill squeal from miles away as it tried to turn on a dry bearing. You could hear, if you tried, the soft click of a jar lid settling on a cloth. At the very edge of town, a tall grass blade trembled and stilled and trembled again, as if something had passed by without a footstep. Nora stood on her porch with the photo under the porch light and looked not at the children but at the space between them, the small shoulder-width gaps that told of bodies and breath, and she pressed her thumb to the margin as if she could smooth the paper into the present. Hector set the same picture on his bedside table, next to a bowl of bent nails and a ribbon. He reached over and turned off the lamp by feel, and in that second between light and dark, he saw the eyes white and did not flinch. Miss Albright placed her copy beside the peppermint jar and left the jar open even though she had learned to keep lids on things. Me put the photo face down and traced the two words on the back with her finger. Slow, one letter after the other, like a promise you do not yet know how to keep. The town lay down the way a tired animal does with care, with one ear open. The school's windows gave back the stars and the shape of the gym roof and the faint outline of a crooked line made by a crack that had widened in the drought. In a field beyond mile 19, where the ground does not forget what it has held, a wind moved across the short grass and made a sound like paper rubbed between fingers. The kind of sound you almost miss unless you are listening, unless you have taught yourself to live inside a whisper. The door was there the whole time, hiding under grass that had learned to lie still. When the latch finally gave, the breath that rose from below smelled like chalk and old fear. The weeks after the jar felt different, as if the town had shifted on its foundations and found a new angle to hold the weight. People still spoke in low voices, but now there was an ache beneath the whisper, the ache of wanting to press the whisper into a shape. Science came first because that was the order the sheriff knew and the order Me could live with. A state lab in a building that smelled like static and coffee took the photograph and shaved off what it could without making a wound. They said they could taste nitrate in the emulsion, which meant the paper had lived close to fertilizer or soil rich with it. It meant farm, not city. It meant jars in fields, not jars in garages. A woman with a calm face and steady hands listened to the paper under a certain light and said it remembered the press of a thumb, not on the back, but in the flash. Flash cubes, she said, and the way she said it made the room sit up, not the long bars that came later. A cube you twisted by hand after each burst, mounted on top of the camera like a little city of light. They left a signature on the eyes when a picture was taken in low fog. A tight white oval like the ones that looked back at them now. The lab didn't tell them who, but it made the when and the how more real than rumor. A stargazer drove in from 2 counties over with a backpack of star maps and a voice soft enough that you had to lean to hear him. He took the photo and didn't look at the faces. He looked at the slice of sky above the children's heads, a dark that was not quite empty. He made shapes with his hands in the air and traced where he thought the lines would go. There, he said, tapping the margin with a blunt finger, a faint tilt of Cassiopeia, a smudge where the Pleiades would be about to rise. The way Orion lands when he is low just before he shows himself. The humidity would scatter the light, he said, which changed the edges but not the angle. He dated the sky to a single night when the stars had stood in that exact place and the fog had sat low over the fields. One night near the end of October 1980. He said the time of the flash by the position of the stars would be about 2 in the morning if the horizon was true. It was not proof that any of them had been there then. It was a clock the sky had kept anyway and now offered up to a room that had run out of clocks. Me listened, nodding when the lab woman spoke and nodding again when the stargazer lifted his hands. She held both facts the way you hold 2 ends of a rope pulled in opposite directions. Sheriff Pike wanted to call a press conference and didn't. He walked from his office to the back room and back again and told himself that more information was coming. Nora heard all of this because she sat at the back of the room and kept very still, the way you do when you do not want to knock anything over in case everything is fragile and most of it is. She kept her fingers in her pockets. She did not want to leave fingerprints on the air. Hector listened with his head bowed. He respected men who knew stars and women who read chemicals the way he respected people who could fix a squeak you could not find. He thought about his hiccuping clock again and did not say it aloud because he did not want the room to turn and look at him like at a child telling stories. Later, he would tell me anyway, not because he thought it helped, but because he had promised himself that he would no longer hold little things alone. The search that followed was slow because the ground was hard and the air was mean. They walked not just where the windmill bolts stuck up like teeth, but in a wide circle around that place, counting fence posts, looking for anything that did not match the memory of dirt. It wasn't a dog who found the door. It was a boy, one of the new generation, boots too clean yet, who kicked at a square of ground because it sounded wrong. A thud, not a hollow. He called out, voice cracking, and then waved so hard his arm looked like it might come off. Men and women came at a run and then slowed because sometimes you run into the dark, and sometimes you step into it 1 inch at a time. Under the mat of prairie grass and a thin sheet of hard-packed dust, there was a wooden trapdoor with a rusted latch. The latch was old and flowered along the edges with orange and brown. The wood held the tight grain of oak cut long ago and primed against weather. Someone had cared about keeping rain out. Sheriff Pike crouched with his flashlight and scraped back the dirt with a gloved hand. "Don't open it," Me said before she could stop herself, and then added, softer, "Not until we're ready." Pike nodded and waited for the state team to bring the camera that would watch them watch the door, the way people do now. The camera looked at them with its single glass eye and did not blink. When the latch turned, it did so with a little cry, high and sharp, like a hinge that had been denied the kindness of oil for too long. Air rose from below, slow and steady. It carried the smell of stale chalk and damp concrete and the sour hint of old insulation breaking down into a sweet rot that made the back of the throat itch. A ladder descended into dark. Hector leaned in and put his hand on the first rung, not to climb, but to feel the temperature. It was cooler below by enough to make the skin pull tight along his forearms. Me went first because she could not ask other people to do what she would not. And because she had been living with this hole in the town for 25 years, and she needed to see if this was its mouth. The ladder led to a narrow corridor lined with insulation that hung in gray and pink tatters like tired flags. The walls were framed with studs rough cut, and the air had the dust of a place that had tried to keep itself a secret and almost had. A single string of lights ran along the ceiling, bulbs missing, bulbs present, and when someone found the switch near the door and flipped it, half the bulbs blinked to life and the others held their breath. The corridor turned once, twice, and each turn made the little hairs along me's neck lift because it felt like a rabbit warren built not by an animal but by a person who knew the shape of fear. At the end, a door waited, not heavy, not theatrical, just a door painted the color of chalk put down then rubbed away. Its knob was cold. Inside was a classroom, not a room like a classroom. A classroom, 32 desks of old metal and wood sat in rows on a floor painted to look like tiles. The desks were numbered in black marker on the upper left corner, the numbers neat and square. A map of the county hung on the far wall, edges curled from humidity with pinholes scattered across it like a rash. A clock hung above the chalkboard and the hands were stuck at 2:17 a.m., the second hand frozen between ticks. The chalkboard itself held a faint shadow of wiped words, that soft ghost text that remains when a hand erases and the slate forgives but remembers. The windows were not windows at all, but painted rectangles with curtains that did not move. The curtains had been laundered once and not again. The color in the room was wrong by a shade. It was close enough to make the stomach turn. Miss Albright did not come down at first. She stood above ground and pressed her knuckles to her teeth until the skin went white. She understood something without seeing it. When she finally climbed down, slow, careful, one rung at a time, she had learned how to breathe. She entered the room and stopped 2 steps in. Her hand rose on its own and hovered over desk 7 like a blessing. She looked at the jar of peppermints on the teacher's desk. There was a jar, it was empty. Dust ringed the inside like a tide line. A lesson plan sat under a paperweight, a worksheet in her hand from that year, copied and then copied again, the edges gone gray. She picked it up and turned it over and found the neat notes she used to make for herself in the margins, circles around verbs, arrows to remind her where to pause. The handwriting was hers and not. The E's ended wrong. She put the paper down and did not cry because something about this room made noise feel like breaking a spell. They catalogued everything, the way you do when you know you have stepped into a place a future jury might need to hold. The map with its pinholes became a field of questions. The pins, when replaced and counted, lined up with bus stops and backroad turnouts and the grid of a route that had once been. A set of green lines drawn faintly near mile 19 suggested a reroute that had never been used or had been used once and then erased by another hand. The janitor's broom lined in a corner of the room as if it had been set there by someone who had decided sweeping could wait until later and later never came. In the teacher's desk, third drawer down, wrapped in a red cloth, lay a small collection of items that had not been on any inventory, a gold necklace with a thin chain and a tiny charm in the shape of a cat, a marble blue as sky, a ribbon. Nora put her hand on the desk edge to keep from falling. "That's mine," she said, nodding at the necklace. She had thought she had lost it long before the year of the bell. She had told herself she had set it on a windowsill and knocked it behind the radiator and that someday she would move the radiator and there it would be. She had not moved the radiator. It was here, wrapped as if someone had been saving it. The clock on the wall became the heart of the room. 2:17, not the time of the bell, not the time of the lunch call, not the hour when the corridor clock had hiccuped like a breath held too long. The stargazer's date and the stopped hands made a pair. Me stood on a chair and reached up with gloved fingers and touched the glass. It was cold even in the stale air. She lifted the clock down and turned it over. The battery had been removed and set in the bottom of the casing. It was crusted with white at the edges. She imagined a hand unsnapping the back, taking the battery out at that exact second, and smiling because it felt like control. Someone had decided time here would stop there. Control is always the ugliest word when it is honest. They found a thin layer of dust on the desktops, and then on 3 of them a finger mark, the curve of a print where someone had drawn a circle absent-mindedly. There were no footprints on the floor because the floor had been wiped in long straight lines. The edges where the floor met the wall held crumbs of chalk. The chalk tray under the board held 3 stubs, green, yellow, white. The green had been used to draw a small tree in the corner of the board and then rub it out. The shape remained if you knew where to look. A small rectangle beside the map had tacks in 4 corners and nothing between, which meant a poster or a calendar had once been there and had been removed. Hector touched the tack heads and felt the rust bloom onto his glove. The corridor outside the room carried sound strangely. You could whisper and hear your voice wrap around you like a scarf. Someone had stapled old insulation to the studs and then pushed paper over it in sheets to make a wall that pretended to be solid. In one section, the paper had peeled at the edge to show the brand name and a cartoon of a smiling man in a hat. Time had lifted itself into joke. In another, the paper was cut clean and then patched. A small square. Some people call that a trap, a place to pass things through, food or notes, without opening the door. There were pencil marks at the edge of that square, hash marks a person might make when keeping time or counting something and trying not to forget. There were 12 and then a space and then 12 again, stacked until the stack made a small ladder up the wall. Some counted days and then started over, or months, or children whose names they were trying to keep in their mind in order. When people saw the room, the fault lines broke wider. One side said this was proof no one wanted. The other said it was theater built to hurt them. Mercy and suspicion sat on opposite sides of the same table and cried into their sleeves. Pike asked for interviews and got them one by one, like pulling nails from wood you are not sure you want to take apart. The first was Ray, who came with his cap in his hands and a map he had drawn in pencil on the back of an old memo. "They told me to change the route that week," he said. "Not for the morning, for the afternoon, pick up on County K instead of North Elm because there was a delivery coming to the school and they didn't want the bus blocked." He stared at the paper. "I wrote it down and then I rubbed it out and I wrote it down again because it didn't sit right in my head." "Who told you?" Sheriff Pike asked, pen ready. Ray swallowed. "A man from the district office," he said. "He gave his name, but it was a name that slid off my mind later. I should have written it. I didn't, that's on me." He looked at me when he said the last part because he wanted the only person he trusted to hold his confession like a kind thing. The attendance ledgers came down from the shelf with their dust jackets of time. The secretary who had kept them had hands that shook when she handed them over. She took the lid off her past and watched men lay it out in good light. On the day of the bell, the morning column held 32 check marks neat as stones in a path. The noon column had them too, and then under the erasers rub another number, a faint 31 stored like a second thought. On the day after, a blank where a note should have been, the space for remarks clean. The days that followed showed annotations that had not made sense then and did not sit easier now. The principal remembered telling the secretary to stop writing certain things down because they mudded the record. He did not remember why he had said that or who had told him to. He cried when he said it. Some men cry the way wood creaks before breaking. He had not been a bad man. He had been a man who knew the shape the story should take and tried to push the facts to fit until the facts pushed back and he gave up. He called that protection, and then he called it what it was. He put both words on the table and left them there. Miss Albright's private field notes had lived in a shoebox under her bed until the day the jar came. On paper torn from teacher plan books and written in the corner like she didn't want anyone to know she took herself seriously, she had tracked small things. Who cried after lunch because the rain had made fingers cold. Who brought a frog and tried to call it a grasshopper, and how the laugh had sounded when he knew he was caught. Who had asked about the word vanish and what it really meant and if it meant you might disappear and be okay. On one page, dated in a hand so neat it looked like she had been sitting very straight when she wrote it, she had scribbled 3 notes that now stood under a light. 10:16 copier back fast. 10:18 hum changed. Hector by tile clock pause. She had written a question mark because she had not trusted her senses and because you should not put yourself at the center when the world is breaking. On another page, a week before, she had made a list of places for a field trip she had wanted to try: Orchard, Windmill, History Museum with maps. She had written lantern demonstration and then crossed it out because she worried about fire and safety. She had not written the word vanish anywhere there. She saw that and swayed. Motives rose from the dirt like bones. They were not neat, and they did not fit together in a clean skeleton everyone could point to and say, this is the cause, this is the shape. Some were kind at the root and ugly at the blossom. Protection made secret paths in the record because someone thought if the story looked a certain way, the rest of the world would be gentler. That was a mistake that now had teeth. Pennants lay in the room under the grass, in the careful desk numbers, in the wrapped necklace, in the map with pins where a person had pressed a point into paper until it made a bruise. If someone had taken the class and forced them below ground for a night, they had also stood above them later in a different room and tried to build a place where they could be safe in the shape of what they knew. Control sat in the stopped clock and the battery set aside like a crown. Control lived in the green line on the route map that turned at mile 19 without asking why. Control signs a name you do not remember and then expects to walk away clean. The interviews unwound and snapped. A deputy drove to the district office of a different town 40 miles away and asked an old man in a back room if he remembered a memo from October 1980. The old man didn't, but he kept everything, and in a drawer he found a copy on thin paper, the kind that wrinkles if you look at it. It mentioned road work on North Elm that day and suggested a temporary afternoon change. The signature block was typed and the name had faded. The ink used for the initials was different than the ink used to write the date, like it had been added later. The memo had been filed under Transportation MISC. No one could say who wrote it. No one could say why it had been done that day and not the rest. The town took that paper and put it next to the photo and let the space between them burn. When they took apart the map in the room under the field to move it to a place where it could be read without breathing in mold, a small sliver of paper fell from behind it. It was torn from a calendar October. The days had little marks written next to them, not numbers, not letters, just slashes. 3 on the 10th, 1 on the 12th, 10 slashes next to the 30th. The 31st had nothing. Nora looked at the way the slashes had been made and recognized the pressure of a hand that was trying not to go through the paper. On the back of the sliver in pencil was a single short word in a square hand. Done. The lab said the graphite matched the kind used on the back of the photograph. That did not make the hand the same. It made the pencil behave like a close cousin. The room had no beds, no food stores, no water. If children had been there, they had not been there long, or someone had taken care to take everything with them. There were no names written on the desks. There were no little drawings tucked under lids. It was a place made to be looked at and a place made to be believed. It had been arranged with the care of a person who had lived in a classroom enough to know the angles of chairs and the exact way a stack of paper sags when edged to the corner of a desk. It frightened people more than a rough bunker might have. This was devotion, and it was a dare. Ray drove his old route in his head for the 1000th time and stopped at the place where mile 19 met the section road. He didn't stop there back then. He had driven past because his orders were for the afternoon. Now he pulled over, put the bus he no longer owned into a gear it didn't have, and stared at the ditch. The ditch looked the way ditches look everywhere, some trash, some weeds, a trickle when it rains, a bed for fog. He thought about stopping a bus on a morning when the fog had stood like a wall and asking 32 children to get out and line up. He tried to see who could have asked it. He tried to put a familiar face behind the camera. His mind offered him the shape of a man whose name slid away. He hated his mind for being kind to him. Hector showed me a nail he had pulled from the trapdoor. Its head was shaped by a hammer that was old-fashioned. Not antique, not modern. He liked to hold a thing and feel what other hands had done to it. He said the hammer had a chip in one claw because the nail head had a little raised crescent from where the claw had slipped and then caught. He could see the shape of the palm that had swung it. He told me he could pick the hammer out of a bucket if someone set it in one. He wanted nothing more than to set his hand into that bucket and lift that tool to the light, and ask it questions so simple they would be kind. The question of who took the photograph settled in the room like dust. It was the secret the picture kept for itself. The science could say the light was this, the chemicals were that. The stars could say the sky had worn that face exactly once that autumn. The map could hint. The route could move like a finger following a line. The door could open. The clock could stop. The hand that held the camera did not raise itself from paper to answer. People looked at each other and looked away. Some suspected a stranger because it is easier to fear a shadow than a reflection. Some suspected a person they had loved because pain likes to point to something that can feel it. Me held the space between suspects and did not let it tip into names. She had done this long enough to know when nomming would be a form of harm. Sheriff Pike talked to a man who had kept records of flash cubes sold from the drugstore back then because he kept records of everything. He still had the carbon copy from the order form dated in early October 1980. 50 cubes. He named the names of the people who had bought some on the days after because the women at the counter wrote them down then in case someone wanted more. None of the names were strangers. They were people you would expect, parents buying for birthdays, the newspaper man, the principal's wife for a church event. Pike crossed the list with the list of those who had direct reason to stand on that road at 2 in the morning and found overlap that meant nothing and a few lines that made him pause. He brought the paper to me like a child with a spider in a jar. She looked. She did not put her finger on the glass. As more interviews unwound, certain truths got smaller and sharper. The principal had altered ledgers the day after because someone from the state said they didn't want numbers that could cause panic. He thought this was mercy then and learned it had not been. The secretary had been told by a voice on the phone to keep remarks to a minimum, and when she asked the name twice, the person had hung up. She had not written the time of the hang-up and wished now that she had. The janitor's note about the clock hiccup was a dot in the right place on a page no one could read. Miss Albright's field notes were simply proof that she had been paying attention in a way that no one rewards until too late. Ray's map in pencil was an artifact of how a man carries orders he doesn't like, in his pocket, in his head, in the crease of his mouth. They found one more jar, smaller, only a few feet from the first. It rose from the dirt like a slow breath. Inside was not a photo but a strip of film, clear except for the soft image of a hand held up, palm out as if to block light. The hand was adult. The fingers were long and nicked. A ring was visible, a thin band. The lab said the strip came from the end of a roll when you pop the back open too early and the light gets in, saving only the last frame's ghost. The historian said some cameras leave a scratch that is their own on the emulsion. This one did, a thin curve at the lower edge. She thought she had seen that curve in a roll from a church picnic kept in a shoebox by a woman down on River Street. They asked the woman and she brought the shoebox to the station, hands firm despite age. The scratch matched. The camera had lived in this town. The hand measured to 3 men who had hands that size. None of them were alive anymore. 2 had moved, 1 had drowned. The control slipped away again and joined the clock. People wanted answers the way thirsty soil wants water. You cannot pour too fast. It will run off and take the top away. Me spoke in the gym under the hoops again and said what could be said. The room under the field existed. It had not been used long. The picture was real and old and taken in fog. The sky and the clock were friends. The jar words matched handwriting but not exactly, a cousin instead of a twin. The bus route had been redrawn for one afternoon by a person whose name had been lost on purpose or by accident. The ledgers had been scrubbed. They would hold the people who did the scrubbing accountable in the only ways that were possible now, with printed apologies and with the heavy work of saying out loud what had been avoided for 25 years. She spoke the words protection, penance, control, and let them hang in the air without pointing. Nora listened with the photo in her lap and the necklace warm in her fist and thought about bearing. People say, I can't bear it, like the weight is a body. She had learned you can bear more than you want, but you choose how you stand under it. Some people bend and stay bent. Some people set the weight down and walk away. Some shoulder it together and it becomes a platform you can stand on to see farther. She looked at Miss Albright, who looked smaller than the room and yet was the only thing anchoring it. She looked at Hector, whose hands were steady even when the nails in them were shaking. She looked at Ray and saw a man who would forgive himself last. She looked at me and saw someone who had been built for this kind of holding and had never wanted to be. They went back to the room under the field one last time before sealing it in the way archives seal things, not to forget them but to keep them from air and hands that could be careless. Before the final descent, me stood at the trapdoor and asked the town to give her a minute alone. People stepped back as if the ground itself had asked. She climbed down and sat at the teacher's desk and took the jar from beside the empty peppermint jar and set it on the wood. She imagined a person standing exactly where she sat, arranging desks and counting chairs, aligning a map until the pins made a shape that felt like control. She imagined that person taking the photograph and unfolding it and tracing each face with a finger and saying, everyone present, as a promise, not a threat. She imagined that person putting the jar down and telling themselves that closing a lid could be a steadying act, like tucking a child in, like finishing a sentence. She did not forgive whoever had taken power they had no right to take. She did not excuse whoever had told a bus where to stop. She did not know whether the person under this room had been the same as the person behind the camera. She let that not knowing sit beside her. It was a companion now, not an enemy. She stood and walked the rows. She stopped at desk 7 and rested her hand the way Miss Albright had. She stopped at desk 12 because the leg still wobbled the way it had in the real room upstairs long ago, a wobble Hector had been meaning to fix before and had never gotten to because he had been called to the gym, then the office, then the field. She trailed her fingers along the chalk tray and picked up the yellow stub and wrote a single word in the corner where the green tree had been rubbed out. She wrote home. The chalk broke at the end of the E and made a little dot like a period. She put the chalk back in the tray with care, as if it were fragile as bone. Above ground, the town waited with eyes half closed, as if holding its breath for a plunge it wasn't sure it could surface from. When Me came up, she had dust in the seam lines of her face and something gentler in her mouth than people expected. "We'll close it," she said. "We'll keep it. We'll write down what we know and what we don't. We'll mark the place on the map. We will not make it a tourist stop or a dare. We will teach it to the ones who come next, the way you teach a story you want them to hold with both hands." No one cheered. Cheer is for games. People nodded. Some cried. Hector reached into his pocket for a clean cloth and then used his sleeve instead. The last thing they did before the door shut was to set the clock back on the wall and leave it as they found it, hands at 2:17, because changing it would be a lie. The sky did what skis do in late summer. It lowered and then lifted, and one evening the wind finally brought the smell of rain. The first drops fell fat and far apart and left polka dots on the school's walkway. Children too young to know what the dots meant laughed and put out their tongues. Old men looked up and closed their eyes and let the drops hit their faces like forgiveness and did not say the word drought because saying it would be unkind. The ground drank careful sips. The cracks closed their mouths a little. Nora took the necklace from her pocket at home and threaded it over her head. It felt lighter than it had 25 years ago. It lay at the hollow of her throat where she had learned to keep grief. She went to her shelf and took down the book with the blue cover and slid the little drawing of the cat back between the pages so only the ears showed. She turned off the lamp and sat in the dark a minute to listen to the old house talk to itself the way old houses do. She thought of the photograph and the eyes looking white. She thought of her daughter's eyes in her memory, bright and alive and mischievous. She saw both at once and let them layer, not perfect, but close enough that her chest hurt in the good way, the way that proves a heart still works. Hector went to the school on a Sunday when the halls were his again for an hour. He opened the janitor's closet and took out his shoebox. He added the little sliver of calendar the lab had let him keep because it had not been evidence of anything except time passing. He put it between the ribbon and the marble and the screws and said their names in the quiet. He walked down the east hall and paused under the clock where he had seen the hand press its nose to time. It behaved itself today. He smiled at it anyway, forgiving a thing that had not sinned. Miss Albright took her jar of peppermints and filled it and set it on her table at home. She did not bring it back to school. She had retired long ago, but she held lessons at her kitchen table once a week now for kids who had lost threads and needed a hand to follow them back. She emptied the shoebox of field notes not to throw them away but to file them in order. She pulled out the page with 10, 18 and drew a line under it and wrote one more sentence. I came back. She let the words sit. Coming back was not to that moment, it was to herself, it was slow, it was work, it was aloud. Sheriff Pike stood in his office and wrote a press release that did not promise the world and did not tell it to go away. He sent it and turned off the light and sat in the dark for a while with the picture of the classroom open on his desk. He thought about running for re-election and decided to, not because he wanted attention, but because you don't hand off a load halfway up a hill if you can keep your feet under you. He called me and left a message that did not say thank you because some thanks are too big for a phone. Me went to the field at dusk and watched the light drain the color from the grass and give it back as the night rose. She had not been a religious woman, But she had prayed in her own way to this grass and these roads and this building for a long time, and they had prayed back or been kind by accident. She thought about what to keep and what to let go and decided that secrets had to be held like knives, by the blade, not the handle, so they would not be swung without care. The photograph kept its secret for itself. That was its right, the jar had been dug up, that was theirs. She pressed her palm to the ground where the door had been sealed and felt the cool heaviness under her hand and said the names in her head in the order she had learned them, not because she thought it would summon anyone, but because saying them kept the space from closing. The crickets sang their one song. A far windmill squealed one note and then was quiet. Somewhere a porch light clicked on. The town held itself steady, tender on the edges, stiffer in the center, learning, even now, to stand under what it had been given and what it had lost. When rain finally took itself seriously and the gutters found their voices again, the school's windows reflected more than rumor. They showed the shape of people walking in and out, of kids with backpacks that swung as they ran, of a janitor leaning a mop against a wall to fix a tile that had not been sitting right since forever. They caught a sheriff's squared shoulders and an old sheriff's softer ones, a mother pausing on the steps to lift her face into weather, a teacher drawing a looped E on a chalkboard in her own kitchen for a child who needed to see how it curved. The field beyond mile 19 lay down under the weight of water and softened the line where the jar had come up. The windmill bolts rusted a little more. The silo's curve blurred under fog. It was not a happy ending, and it was not an ending. It was a choice to keep standing here together. It was a door kept closed and marked, so no one would step into it without knowing what lay beneath. It was the simple act of writing home in a corner where only those who needed to see it would see it, and leaving it there for the next person to find when they were ready. And the quiet knowledge that some things, like a single white oval in a child's eye on a night long ago, would always be too bright to look at straight on. So you learn to hold them at the edge and let the rest of the picture come into view around them.